Welcome to this demonstration of Tyk. I'm going to be showing you how you can use Tyk to create API definitions, how you can add authentication to your API, how you can issue tokens in order to allow access to your API, and how we can create policies in order to manage large amounts of tokens. I'll be showing you how we can add rate limiting and use the endpoint designer to change how the API behaves, and how we can add versioning to an API. Then finally, I'll be showing you how we can use the dev portal to allow key requests, view documentation, and test API endpoints. Throughout the demonstration, I'll be using the Tyk Cloud, but if you want, you could use a hybrid or on-premises installation as well. And I'll be using Postman to generate requests and look at responses. You can get that from getpostman.com. And I'll also be using the Swagger Petstore as the API. You can get that from petstore.swagger.io. But let's start. So I've already got an account on the Tyk Cloud, so I'm going to log in with that. Here we can see some of the recent activity through my account, but we want to just demonstrate this Petstore API, so let's go ahead and add that. So head over to APIs under System Management. We can see some that I already have added, but let's add a new one. So click Add New API. And in here we can see some of the base settings. So we need to add a name. So let's add Petstore. And as we do that, the system will automatically generate an API slug here. And that is a URL-friendly representation of the API name. And it will help Tyk understand which API we're asking for when we make requests to it later on. And the third setting here is the target URL. And this is where Tyk will proxy requests to when they're received by the gateway. So because we want to use the Swagger Petstore, we need to put the correct URL in here. So let's just head over to the Swagger page, highlight that URL, come back to the dashboard and paste that in. Okay, so there's one more thing we need to change on here before we can just do a test request of this and see if it's working. And I'm going to do that now. So let's change the authentication mode to be open. And what this will do is mean that the gateway will not check for any form of authentication before it sends the request on. Before I click save, I'm just going to highlight the API URL because I'm going to use that. So let's save this. And here we can see it now in the list of APIs. So let's take a look at Postman. Paste that URL into Postman. And when we send this, we can't actually access the root of the Petstore API because there's no response provided from there. So what we need to do is go and check which endpoints are available. So I can see that the Petstore's got a pet endpoint, and if we send an ID to it, we should get a pet back. So let's put that on here. Pet 99. Let's send that request. Great. So we've received back some JSON data here. Says it's a dog called TJ. So let's just check to see whether that's the actual response the API is giving us if we go there directly. So if we come back up here, let's take that URL, check pet 99. Yeah, it's the same data. So what we've seen there is that we've added the API definition to Tyk, and then we've been able to send a request. It's gone via the Tyk Cloud, gone to the Swagger Petstore API, requested pet 99, and that response, that JSON data, has come back via the gateway and returned to Postman here. We can see it in the response. And that's how easy it is. So we've just set that API up, but in reality, most people are going to want to secure their API. So let's see how we can do that. To do that, we need to head back over to the dashboard. We need to go and edit our API definition and go back down to the bottom where the authentication is defined. Change that from open to auth token. With auth token, just one of the simplest forms of authentication. It will allow us to issue tokens to users, which they can use as part of the request in order to authenticate. And with auth token, we have a number of different configuration options. By default, it will check the header for a token, and you can define which header key it will check against. In this case, it's authorization, which is standard. And then there's some other settings as well if you want to do slightly different stuff. But I'll leave it as standard for now. Let's go back up here and click on update. Right, so this API has now been updated to require authentication. And what that means is that if we go back over to Postman and try requesting this again without any authentication, it's going to fail. Yeah, so this time we get back a 401 unauthorized, and we also get back a message telling us that the authorization field was missing. So in order to remedy this, we need to go and make a key. So back over to the dashboard, click on keys, add key. Now there's a lot of settings in here, but let's just focus on the ones that are necessary, and that is the access rights. So from access rights, pick the Petstore, click on add. Actually, we also need to set this value here because it's a required field. However, the quota's set to -1, so they're unlimited anyway, so it's sort of irrelevant. But the access rights is the most important thing. Let's create that. Okay, so what we've generated here is a token. I've copied it to clipboard. Head back over to Postman. Now let's use that in our request. So you have to click on the headers tab here and add the authorization header. So authorization is the key and the token is the value. Let's send that request. Great, so we have access again. And that's nice, but if you were issuing thousands or millions of these keys and you wanted to change them easily, then by handling your keys like this, generating them all individually, that could be rather difficult. So what we've done is created the concept of a policy. And the policy, if you go over to System Management Policies, let's add one now. The policy is a way for you to predefine most of the settings of a key in one place. So let's give it the name Petstore. And here we can see some of the settings that were also available in the key. So rate limits, usage quotas, let's just set that again, and access rights. So I'm going to set the access rights to be for the Petstore. Let's click on add, so that's in there. And then I'm going to change the expiry as well to do not expire the key. Let's create that policy. So this time, if we create a key, we're able to create it against the policy. So instead of setting all these things manually, I'm just going to pick the policy from here. Pick Petstore, click on add, and now we can see all those settings we just made are automatically defined here. Let's check that that works. So there it is, there's the key, copy that, come over here to Postman, paste it into the value box and test. Great, that works too. But let's demonstrate the real value of the policy. So the real value is that the policy will, when it's changed, it will affect all the keys associated with it. So instead of having to change each key, let's go into this policy and let's change the rate limit. Let's set that to something low, 3, and update it. Now what we'll find is that even though we've not changed the key directly, that it's now subject to a rate limit. So if I send a bunch of requests now, we'll find that we'll hit that rate limit pretty quickly. Yeah, there we go. So we've hit the rate limit and we've had a 429 too many requests returned to us, and the error message is that the rate limit was exceeded. But since I want to be able to demonstrate other things, I'm just going to set that back up to a higher number. Okay. All right. So next up, let's change how the API behaves. So in order to do that, go into edit the API. We are going to use the endpoint designer. So click on that. Now, there are different ways of doing it. One of them is through what we call global version settings. So these will apply to all versions, which we can add. But what I'm going to do is actually change the behavior of a particular endpoint. And so to do that, I need to click on Add Endpoint. And in here, we can define the path. So let's say that we want to define the behavior of the path pet1. So in here, we can pick the plugin. So I'm going to use a mock response. And when using a mock response, I also have to pick a list. So I'm just going to pick an ignore list for now, which will let me then use the mock response. So with the mock response, we get to change or select the code that we want to use and the body. So let's say hello world. And we can also set some headers. All right. So what this means is that when a request is made to this API and it matches this path, that the gateway, instead of proxying the request upstream to the target, it's actually going to generate the response itself, and it will send back this data instead. So before we do anything with that, let's go and see what actually happens right now if we request pet1. So pet1 does not exist. So let's see what happens now if we update this. Let's update the API. So now we've set that that endpoint for pet1. The gateway will respond with our mock response instead. Let's test that out. Yeah. So this time, now with our updated API definition, we've matched the path and the gateway's responded with our hello world. And also, if we check the headers, we can see it's added that hello world header in as well. That's great. So next up, let's check how we can change how versioning affects an API. So if you go into the API definition and select versions, by default, versioning is not used. So we have to untick that box. Then what we can do is get access to the versioning config. So first option is to say where the version data is going to be located. By default, it will be in the header. We'll leave it at that, but you could actually pick either URL or form parameter or part of the URL path if you want, but I'm going to leave it as header. Then we have an option to say how we're going to identify the version information. And by default, that's through a header key called X API version. And then below that, we have the actual versions themselves. So by default, we have default version, but I'm going to add in version 2. And by adding version 2, I can override the target. So if I had my version 2 of my API somewhere else, rather than on Swagger Petstore, then I could focus on that there. And I can also expire the version as well. So if I had old versions I didn't want to have accessed anymore, I could add a date in there and the gateway would prevent access to those. But I'm just going to leave it blank for now. Okay, so here we go. We've added version 2. And that means now that if I go back over to the endpoint designer, instead of just having default as my version here, I'll actually have version 2 available as well. And it also means that, as you can see here, for the default version, it's still got my endpoint definition for that mock response. If I select version 2, we see that that doesn't exist anymore. So what we can now do is see whether that's working. So let's click on update just so those updates are applied. Let's come back over to Postman. Now, if I just send this request, the first thing we'll get back is an error message. And this error message is because we get a 403 forbidden and version information not found. And this is because we've now turned versioning on for the API. And that means that we have to provide our version information in the request. Now, I said that I was going to send it as part of the headers, and that was X API version, and then the value. So I could say value, the value for the version is going to be default. So this should actually get back our mock response again. Yeah, it does. Now, if I wanted to access version 2, which doesn't have the mock response, I can change that. Now, when I send this request, this one's actually going to fail as well, but for a different reason. And this is because this one's been forbidden due to access to this part of the API not being allowed. And this is because our policy, when we created it, our access rules were defined so that only the default version of the API was accessible, and it didn't include version 2. So in order to get access to that, we need to come back over to the dashboard, go to policies, edit the Petstore, go down to access rights, and then in here, select Petstore 2, add that, and then we've got default and 2. Let's click on update. So we've updated the policy now so that all the keys associated with it will have access to both versions of the Petstore API. Now, if we send that request, great. So what we've got is we've got an error message, which is correct because that pet doesn't exist, but it's actually come through the gateway. So, I mean, if I was to ask for pet 99, we'll get back TJ this time. And that's the same response that we would get if we ask for through default as well, because with default, we haven't got any mock responses set up or any other changes for that particular path. Okay, so that's what we've seen here is we've changed the rate limits, we've used the endpoint designer to change the behavior of an API, and then we've used versioning, and we've been able to issue different versions of an API and have those behave differently as well. So the last thing I'm going to demonstrate is the developer portal, because so far everything I've been doing is through the dashboard, but that would mean that as the API owner, I'd be responsible for generating all the keys and issuing them to people. But you might want your API consumers to be able to self-service. So that's what the developer portal's for. Let's take a look at that. So if I just switch over here, I've already got, you can actually access the developer portal by clicking on open your portal here, and that will open the configured page for it. So I've already logged in, I've created a developer account on here, which is separate to the dashboard accounts. And the developer accounts, what they can see, if we click on API Catalogue, is they can see all the APIs that I have published, essentially. So at the moment, there's only this NASA Curiosity one. So let's add the Petstore in. So to do that, that's in the portal management section. So we need to go to Catalogue and then add. Let's give it a name, Petstore. And we have to pick a policy. So what this means is that any keys that are requested through this catalog will be assigned the policy that we pick here. And then we can add some information in. This is the Swagger Petstore API. And this can be marked down if we want. So I haven't added any markdown in there, but you can do if you wish. And let's update that. Oh, the last thing we need to do actually is tick the Show API checkbox. So re-update that and reload this page. Great, so now we've got our entry for the Petstore. So I can request a key for this. If I do that, I need to just say why I'm requesting the key. And this is configurable. So if I go back to the dashboard and go to settings, all the settings, the general settings for the portal are in here. So we can require key approval, for example, whereby if I make a key request, it doesn't get approved automatically. We need someone to come in and monitor the key requests and approve those through there. But I've turned that off for the moment. But what we're just seeing now is the key request form. So we've added 2 fields in here to allow consumers to say what their app is and their use cases. So we'll keep that on file against their user record, and we can review that later on if we're interested. So I'm just going to type pet in there twice and request that key. And that's been generated. So here's my key. So I'm going to copy that, go over to Postman, paste that in there. And then this time we send that. We'll see that that works as well. So this key was generated essentially without the need for anyone, any API owner or any part of that organization needing to do anything. So we've got that automatically. But one thing that you could say is a problem is that perhaps as a consumer, I might not know how this API works. So what we have is support for Swagger documentation. So that's all defined through the Catalogue. So go back to Catalogue, click on Edit for the Petstore. What we have down the bottom here is the documentation section. So you can provide documentation in Swagger or API Blueprint format. I'm going to use Swagger. So if I click Attach Documentation, I'm going to paste in a Swagger file. So pick on Swagger file. And I can actually go and get my Swagger document directly from the Swagger Petstore website. So I'm going to copy this URL. Let's take a look at that. So it generates all this JSON for us. Let's copy this Swagger definition, but because it's been minified, let's just run it through the JSON linter to get a nice prettified version where we can see what's going on. So I've done that, copy that, and paste it into a text editor. Now, because this is a Swagger definition taken straight from the Petstore demo website, it's obviously all the references are to that. So we need to change those particular references so that they are specific to the API that we're publishing through the Tyk Gateway. So the first of those things we need to change is the host here, which is currently targeting the Swagger website. So let's change that to use the Tyk Cloud. And now you'll probably have your own host that you need to put in here, so don't use that one, but use the one for your system. Then we need to also update the path. So I'm going to take Petstore and update the base path there. So it says Petstore, and also need to change the scheme so that it's not HTTP but HTTPS, because that's what we're using on the Tyk Cloud. Okay, so that's the general settings, but we also changed the API to add authentication, and we also used versioning. So the first of those, let's deal with that, is authentication. And we need to look for a section in here called security definitions. There it is. And in there, there's already a section for the API key, but it's using the wrong key name. So we defined our API to use to look for the key authorization. So we need to change that to say authorization. And that's that done. Now we need to deal with the version, because we also have to pass a version header with all requests as well. So to do that, I've actually pre-compiled a couple of snippets here. So that's the first one. We need to go down to the bottom of the Swagger document and just insert that down at the bottom. So the section is called parameters, and inside that I've created an object called API version, which defines the parameter as being in the header. Its key is x-API-version, and it's a string. So that's the parameter created. We then also have to add this to the endpoint. So the endpoint that we're going to change is the pets one. So let's go and find that. So we go type pets / pet ID. This is the one we've been using where we've been passing a integer over. So you can see in here in the definition we've got the various HTTP methods, but let's add this. We could add it to each individually, but you can add it on a per endpoint basis. So we'll do that. Again, I've got a pre-created thing, so let's put that in there. So paste that in. So it's a section called parameters, and it contains an array of these objects, and it's basically a reference to the parameter that we just added down at the bottom of the document. And that'll mean now that when we're looking at this particular endpoint in our documentation, that we'll get the option to add in this API version as well, which is what we need. So now let's highlight all of that, copy it, and go back over to the dashboard. Let's select from Swagger file because it's going to be pasted in rather than it being a URL. So paste that in there, click Attach Documentation. Okay, so let's update that. Okay, so that's the documentation updated. Now we'll find that if we go back to the portal and refresh this page, that we now have an option that says View Documentation. So we'll click on that. And in here, we'll see the Tyk developer portal's version of a Swagger doc. So it looks very similar to what you get on the standard website with the same sorts of sections and information. So you can expand the various endpoints, you can look through them, you can see what parameters that they require, and you can see what sorts of responses they're going to come back with. I'll just change that to JSON because that's what we've been using. So in order to use this, obviously we need to provide our key. So we have to click on Authorize. And in here, we'll see the API key section, which we updated, which is going to create a key a header for us with the key authorization. Let's go over to Postman, copy the token that we've been using in Postman, and paste that in here as the value. Click Authorize. Okay, so now the Swagger doc will send that with any requests generated from here. So let's try it out. So click Try It Out. And we've been using Pet99, and we've also been using versioning, so I have to enter the value for that. So I'll put default. Let's execute. Okay, so you can see here that the request was executed like this, where it's passed in both of the XAPI version and the authorization header, and the server response was a 200 with our object here, TJ the dog, and we've also got the response headers as well. And that concludes the demo.